Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are significant developments across the front lines, with the Russians making several breakthroughs in the northern and southern outskirts of the Donetsk region, and the Ukrainians launching several counterattacks across the front line. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to make several advances and breakthroughs in the southwestern parts towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Zaporizhzhia region along the border area. The Russians have managed to gain control over several fortified positions south of Temerivka as they continue their offensive through the first line of defense of the Zaporizhzhia region towards Huliaipole in the southwestern direction. Russians are slowly pushing through these fortified positions and defensive lines to gain control over the settlements alongside the road leading alongside the defensive line to gain control of it through their weak points, the rear, and their flank. The Russians also managed to advance to the northeast of Komishovacha, storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northeast of the settlement from the northern, eastern, and southern directions. Russians are here looking to gain control over the second line of defense and push through the rear of Komishovacha to gain control over the last settlement here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region along the border area. The Russians here continue their advances along the second line of defense as well, west of Meliivka in the direction of Vorone, where they are storming the fortified positions of the second line of defense of the Ukrainians in the area and reach the outskirts of Vorone as the fighting continues over the outskirts of the settlement. The Russians also bypass Sezhneve from the north, reaching Novoselivka and gaining a foothold in the northern parts of the town, gain control over several fortified positions, forest lines, upwards towards the settlement from Oleksandrorad and Voskresenka. The Russians here pushing through the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, pushing through towards the settlements along the Vovcha river line to gain control over the southern bank of it. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the river line to push upwards in the northern direction towards Anderivka, Kletsova, and Zelenyi, but so far focusing on the southern parts along the second line of defense to gain control over the settlements north of this defensive line and gain control over the pocket area here along Ternove, where there is a road connecting from Zaporizhzhia in the south to Sosnivka in the north, which allowed them to cut off the settlements and fortifications of the Ukrainians in the region of Komishovacha, Vorone, and Sezhneve, where the Ukrainians have established defensive positions. This Russian breakthrough covers 10 square kilometers and allows the Russians to cut off several parts and the northern and southern areas of this Vovcha river line for the offensive operations towards these settlements along the second line of defense, as the Russians continue storming both the first and second lines of defense in the Zaporizhzhia region, showing that they have no interest in giving up the Zaporizhzhia region. Despite this, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said that Putin gave some concessions in his meeting with Trump with regards to the negotiations over Ukraine. In these concessions, he said that he wanted the remaining parts of Luhansk and the remaining parts of the Donetsk region under Russian control, but would accept a front line along the current frontline positions in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. So he's giving up the remaining parts of two separate regions that the Russians have annexed in exchange for receiving the remaining parts of the first region, where they also exchanged the parts in Kharkiv and Sumy that they hold under their control. So territory for territory and giving up claims was the solution he proposed. Despite this, there's no reports of a meeting that will take place between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky as Trump had hoped. He said it would happen within 2 weeks or it won't happen. Now 2 weeks have passed. It becomes clear that it will not happen. At the same time, last night there was a massive missile strike and drone strike on Kiev and Ukraine in general, to which European leaders said this shows Putin does not want to negotiate and that he has given up on negotiations. At the same time, Ukraine also attacked some oil refineries and different targets within Russia, and Trump then stated that both sides have struck each other and he would make a statement on that later. The statement, which has not come out yet, so we'll leave it at that. But based on this, we can see that if the Russian-Ukrainian negotiation process breaks down, then because of these concessions the Russians were willing to make, it becomes increasingly likely that Trump would blame Ukraine for a lack of peace and not Russia, as he had previously stated that it's switching of negotiations and territories would need to take place for the negotiations to be successful. If the Ukrainians do not want to give up territory and the Russians does not want to accept some sort of compromise, then a peace deal will not happen. Well, Russia has accepted a compromise, yet Ukraine would not accept a switch of territories between the Russians and the Ukrainians. In the southern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians have managed to regain control over Tolstoy as they continue to press the Ukrainians in Serenihai and Andrivka-Kletsova following the Ukrainian recapture of both of these settlements. With regards to Dashnet, the Ukrainians managed to regain a foothold in the northern parts of the settlement and regain some positions along the Vovcha River line. The Russians are mainly pushing through towards Velia from the river line itself as well. From this, we see that there's a lot of positional fighting that takes place in the southern parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region due to the close vicinity of Novopavlivka to the front line. The Ukrainian forces are well supplied in this area and has cover of FPV drones, which makes it difficult for the Russians with the stretched supply lines to fight the Ukrainians in this area. As soon as the Russians captured Dashnet, the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks for months now. So we see that the fighting is going back and forth between the Russians and the Ukrainians over these months. Now that the Ukrainians have regained a foothold within the settlement, they may be able to regain control of it and the administrative border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. To the northeast of Mirnorod, the Ukrainians also launched some counterattacks in this direction following the Russian capture of some fortified positions west of Mykolaiivka. The Ukrainians attempted to push across the river line all the way towards Mirne, the southern parts of Melenivka here on the outskirts, to which the Russians quickly managed to destroy this grouping of forces and reclaim positions along the river line. And now fighting is taking place in the southern outskirts of Novoekonomishne, where there's been some direct battles between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians are here attempting to regain control over the river line by attacking the northern and southern flanks of it along the northeastern flank of Mirnorod and Pokrovsk. Moving on to the Lyman section of the front line, there are several advances by the Russians here as well. The Russians managed to gain control over the eastern parts of Zarezhne from the northern outskirts to the southern outskirts. Russians also managed to regain control over the fish farm area north of Torske. With this, the Russians have managed to significantly improve their positions along the eastern flank of Lyman, where direct battles are taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians within the eastern parts of the settlement. The Russians are fighting off against the Ukrainian counterattacks, and the Russians are trying to establish themselves within the settlement, establish a foothold across the Sherebets River line, and logistical supply lines that allows them to continue their battles, while the Ukrainians counterattack with armored vehicles such as AFVs and tanks, which allow them to recapture some positions, but the Russians have a strong position and strong concentration of forces following the capture of Torske and Serbryansky First area, which allows them to continue their offensive operations and increase the area under their control. Russians also storming Mirne from the flank to the southwest of the settlement. Following the capture of the first lines in that direction, they're now flanking Mirne itself, gaining control of which will open the road to Zarezhne from the north, combined with the capture of the fish farm area and the northern outskirts of Zarezhne. The Russians can connect their forces between the northern and southern directions and flank the Ukrainian positions within Zarezhne. While the fighting is taking place within Zarezhne, the Russians also managed to break through the Ukrainian positions here to the northeast of Derilove, gaining control over several forest lines at a deep push along to reach the outskirts of Derilove, where fighting is now taking place on the outskirts of the settlement. Together with the fighting within Senchihorlove and the Russian capture of Zarezhne, the Russians are slowly capturing the supply lines that leads into Lyman from the northwestern direction. Gain control over Senchihorlove, Novoselivka and Derilove will leave just a single supply line in and out of Lyman, to which the Russians can push towards Dobrisheve with the northern flank under their control to gain control over the fortified positions on the outskirts of Lyman in the northwestern direction and cut off the final supply line leading into Lyman from the northwestern direction, leaving just the supply lines through the Sversky-Donetsk River from the Siversk and Sloviansk directions remaining under Ukrainian control, which the Russians can strike using artillery, MLRS, and airstrikes on the crossings and bridges across the river line. With this, we see that the Russians continue offensive operations towards Lyman, and the Ukrainian forces being pressed back towards the town itself. The Ukrainians also managed to counterattack here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, regaining control over Novomir and regaining positions here on the western parts of Novomikhailivka, while the Russians are facing off against the Ukrainians directly head-on within the northern parts of the settlement. The Ukrainians are here attempting to regain control over the northern flank and connect their forces between the Ridkodub in the west with Novomikhailivka in the east, which they can regain control over the northern flank of this Russian position here across the Sherbets River line, and to fight over the fortified positions along Nova, to regain control over the positions in the western parts of the Sherbets River line, and to divert the Russian forces attacking the direction of Lyman to also cover the northern flank, which weakened their offensive capabilities in the southern direction. This means that this offensive is not really to regain positions, but instead to direct the Russian forces and weaken their offensive capabilities in the southern direction. What we're seeing across the front line is that the Russians continue their offensive operations to gain control over the Donetsk region, as well as the Zaporizhia region. Both of these are the priorities of the Russians right now, the Donetsk being the #1 priority and Zaporizhia being the secondary priority, while Kherson remains forgotten in the background. The Russian push towards gaining control over Zaporizhia comes from the attempt to gain control over the first and second defensive lines in the eastern and western outskirts of them. The Russians are storming the defensive lines actively on the eastern flank while trying to reach the flanks of them in the western flanks. Both of these attempts are to strengthen their positions, to weaken the Ukrainian fortifications and gain control over them, and to gain control over logistical hubs that are centered in the first and second lines of defense, which will allow the Russians to significantly improve their offensive capabilities and bypass the fortifications of the Ukrainians for a future capture of the Zaporizhia region. For this, the Russians need to gain control over the remaining parts of the Vovcha river line, to push through the river line and push towards Pokrovsk to gain control over that city as a logistical hub, to gain control over the first and second lines of defense all the way up towards Huliaipole in the east, and then connect their forces between Huliaipole and Orikhiv from the eastern and western flanks towards the town, to gain control over that as well, while at the same time pushing through the second line of defense from the eastern flank, gain control over Huliaipole, Orikhiv, and Pokrovsk, will allow the Russians to have 3 logistical hubs under their control within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, which allow them to stage offensive operations towards Zaporizhia directly head-on. The Ukrainians are already preparing by creating fortifications on the eastern and northern flanks of the city. However, these lack the natural barriers and geographical advantages that the southern defensive lines possess, which means that the Russians will be able to, with a better logistical situation, push through these fortifications at a much easier path than the southern fortifications, while at the same time gaining control of these southern fortifications by flanking them also leaves them vulnerable and diminishes these geographical advantages. At the same time, the Russians are looking to gain control over logistical hubs such as Lyman in the north, Konstantinivka in the east, and Pokrovsk in the south, which will allow them to strengthen defensive operations towards the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.